Hello, Steve here. We're into week 3 of our contemporary ethics course. And this week we're going to look at our second major theory that we're going to be covering and applying throughout the course. Last time we talked about the theory known as utilitarianism, and I also talked about theory in general and the idea of giving reasons for our ethical judgments about actions and laws and policies and that kind of thing. So I won't rehearse that stuff again, but instead just focus on this one view. It's often called a duty-based ethics. It's also called, in a kind of a fancy word, deontological ethics, which is just from the word deon, which means duty. And it's most closely associated with a philosopher named Immanuel Kant. Now, his writing and philosophy has a reputation for being difficult. I try to explain this in a way that makes sense. If you try to do the reading, Kant himself, he can be difficult, although his examples often make clear what it is he's talking about. Now, if you recall, the utilitarian view focused on the consequences of actions or laws, and that the ones that are good morally are the ones that tend to promote happiness. Okay? The actions that promote the greatest happiness are the good ones. The ones that don't, in contrast, are the bad ones. Now, for Kant, though, the consequences aren't important. What matters is following rules. We have a duty, he thinks, a moral obligation to follow the moral rules. And then he has an idea for what these rules will be like, and he subjects them to a test that he calls the categorical imperative. Now, there's a couple different versions of this, and there's actually 3 or 4, depending on how you count. We're only going to focus on 2 here. But once you see them applied to examples, it makes it a little more clear what he's talking about. He's not focused on the outcomes of the action or the law or the policy, but whether or not the rule that you're following is one that is logical or rational in a certain way. Okay, so the first way to understand this categorical imperative is as the claim that an action or policy is right only if it can be made into a universal law. And the second version is that we're looking at is always treat people as ends and never as means only. Again, unpacking these gives us a clearer idea of what they mean. So what I want to do is I'm going to turn to my whiteboard and I'm going to use the classic example of false promises and talk about each one of these in turn. So we're going to start with the first version of the categorical imperative, which says that an action or policy is right only if it can be made into a universal law. We'll call this the formula of a universal law. Now, Kant thinks that when you're acting, when you're doing something, that if it's something you're intentionally doing, that you're following a kind of a rule, okay? And he calls these maxims. So a maxim is, you don't necessarily state it to yourself, but it's supposed to be a subconscious or unconscious rule that you're following. So he thinks, well, if you're going to make a false promise, that is, promise somebody something when you know you're not going to keep the promise, he would say, well, you're following this maxim or this psychological rule that it's okay to make false promises. So the question then is, can this rule be made into a universal law? So the idea is that, well, what if we said, okay, this is a rule that everybody has to follow all the time, always. Not that everybody will follow it, but that we consider in our imagination, what if this were a rule that everybody had to follow all the time? Okay? That's the first step. So the next step for Kant would be, well, let's consider if this were a universal law, this making false promises, what would the world be like in that case? Well, if everyone always made false promises, if that were a universal law, then no one would trust anybody. So maybe you can see now where we're going with this. You say, well, it's okay to make false promises. You want to get out of something. But then if you try to make that a universal law, then nobody would trust anybody. So if nobody trusted anybody, think about that world. Would it be possible to make promises? Well, no one would trust anyone, so promising itself would be impossible. So that would logically follow from making this maxim that it's okay to make false promises into a universal law. So what we end up with is, as I just said, this conclusion that promising would be impossible. So if you are willing to make a false promise, and that's the rule you're following. He says, well, Kant says, well, can you make that into a universal law such that everybody would be making false promises all the time? Well, no one would trust anyone, so promising itself would be impossible. So by making false promises, you're actually contradicting yourself, is the way Kant understands it. So it's irrational to make false promises because it cannot be made into a universal law. As he understands it, ethics is not a matter of exceptions to rules. It's a matter of absolute moral rules that we are obligated to always follow. Now, Kant's second version of the categorical imperative says that we should always treat people as an end and never as a means only. Now, I don't think I need to go to the whiteboard for that. I'll explain it when I go back to it towards the end here of this mini lecture. But the idea is that you should not use people. You should treat them as rational beings like yourself, and that is what showing respect for them means. So the idea is that, well, if you make a false promise, you're in effect lying to someone. If you were not going to be able to keep a promise, you should let them know, I can't make this promise, I can't do this. So you're giving them the facts, you're treating them as a rational being like yourself who deserves to have the facts and deserves to be able to make their own decision. This is how Kant's idea ties into the very modern notion of freedom, and that is liberty. The idea that we are rational beings who make our own choices, and so we need the facts and we need to know what's going on in order to make good decisions. So he thinks that making a false promise would be using somebody, would be treating them not as a rational human being able to make their own decision, but as a thing, really. He thinks that people deserve respect that things don't deserve. Okay, so I'm going to go to the whiteboard one last time here and mention some other types of things and what Kant would say, and contrast it a little bit with the utilitarian view we looked at last week. So to sort of sum up the Kantian view of the categorical imperative, we could say, well, this is a test for rules, whether or not they're good rules to have, morally speaking. So we say, well, are they universalizable is what we'd say. Are they the kind of rules that can be made into a universal law without leading to irrationality or logical contradiction? Secondly, are they rules that show respect for people? That is, they treat people as ends in themselves and not means to some other end. That is, they don't use people. Okay? So, now here I've put three rules that we could consider as being part of just about any moral code we would look at across the world. And we looked at and talked about these last week when I talked about utilitarianism. And so we can see that from the utilitarian view, we could ask in a particular case, well, is it wrong to lie? And say, well, there's some cases where lying will create more happiness. So utilitarian would say, well, some cases it's okay to lie. Same for stealing. There may be cases where stealing will create more happiness than not. Murder may be more questionable, because last time I talked about killing, this time I'm talking about murder in particular, which is an unjustified killing of another human being. So, but if we think about these in terms of universal rules, the lying ties in really nicely with the idea of the false promise. It's a very similar idea. So we said, well, we can't make lying into a universal rule because no one would trust anyone, so it'd be impossible to lie in the first place. And also, lying doesn't respect people because it doesn't treat them as rational beings who deserve to have the truth. Second, on stealing, you'd say, well, we can't make stealing into a universal law because then there would be no private property. If it were always okay to take other people's stuff without permission anytime you wanted to, nobody would own anything, and so stealing would be impossible. Again, the universal rules formation. And then the on respect, you're not treating people as rational beings who should have the choice to do with their property what they want without other people taking it from them without permission. If someone wants to give you permission to take it, that is their choice. So again, it's treating them with respect and not using them. Now murder, again, you can think, well, you couldn't have a universal rule that says it's okay to kill anybody anytime you want to. That would certainly not be a society that would be sustainable. But also you can think how murdering someone is really treating them disrespectfully. That's quite an understatement, that you would be using them towards your own end and take the most valuable thing that they have, which is their own life. So hopefully I explained Kant's duty-based ethics in a way that makes sense and will allow us to apply it to this week's lessons and onward as we move forward in the course. Great, and see you around.